Okay, here we are. A minute or two late, but raring to go. So glad to have you all here today with us for this Celebrate Osteopathic Medicine event. We try to do this every year during or near the National Osteopathic Medicine Week. And you'll see banners downtown that are proclaiming that. They'll be down there for this week and next. But today we have a very special program. And usually we try to feature something about osteopathic medicine that is extracurricular, if you will. And the journey or osteopathic contributions that are made by whatever the presentation is. Today, I'm very happy to say we have a person that's very close to me, a graduate of 2007, WVSOM. She used to live up top of the hill behind me, probably a half mile away or so, and would ride her horses down through our place as Mary and I would wave and whatever. I later did some babysitting for her son. So she's more than just one of our graduates to me, but I want you to meet Dr. Bridget Morris, who has practiced family medicine, but also hospitalist medicine. She is now the head of the health department for Greenbrier County, and of course influences the counties surrounding as well. And she's sort of been our champion to lead the war on the pandemic here. So she has some of that she'll mention or talk about, but I really wanted you to hear her journey through why becoming an osteopathic medicine and osteopathic physician, and then how she got into public health and why. So I'm going to give you Dr. Bridget Morrison.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Foster. Good afternoon. It is such a pleasure to be here today to spend time with all of you all during Osteopathic Week. I remember watching the speakers over the past 20 years and being inspired along the way, and truly being essentially proud of being a part of the osteopathic community. So thank you all for taking time out of your schedule and for having me. And it's truly an honor to be a part of it. So I've been asked to share my personal journey and what got me into medicine, and obviously most specifically osteopathic medicine, and then how my career has shaped me into what I'm doing now, and essentially how I ended up in public health during a pandemic. Talk about living the dream, guys. So my journey, as most of ours did, started when I was very young, perhaps younger than most. So I'm going to give you a little picture here. So picture this. I was a little girl playing outside with a stray dog, and I was 3. I had really curly hair and essentially ringlets for hair. I remember this very vividly. I was running and laughing and playing with this dog, and he was my new friend. And the hair, my little ringlets, kept getting in my eyes. So I was running backward, and suddenly I ran into a huge car. Now, y'all remember how big those cars were back then. They were like big tanks. But specifically, I ran into the hubcap. And as my mom would later say, kind of knocked myself a little silly. Well, the hubcap in the car, it didn't really go very well. Kind of knocked the sense out of me, and as I stood up, I saw blood kind of dripping from my little curls. And I thought to myself, this just might end my play date with my new friend. And then I thought, oh goodness, I just might get into trouble over this one. Well, my dad came out and seen the blood, and he got a little excited. He scooped me up, looked at my head, and as he described it later, it was filleted open. Knew I was going to have stitches. And we were dirt poor at that time, or economically challenged, as you might prefer to say. Didn't own a vehicle, so my dad carried me inside, and he hollered for my mom, whose name was Carolyn, who I'm named after. Carolyn, come take care of Bridget. I have to go and find a ride to the ER. So he sat me on the countertop, and he put a chair beneath my feet, and off he went. So my mom came over, and she grabbed a washcloth, and she got it wet. She put it on the back of my head, and she was addressing this big laceration. I may add that the only thing that I was still worried at that point was if I'm going to get in trouble and where my dog was, my newfound friend. So when my dad left, I remember my mom looking this very unusual color. And again, I was 3, but I remember this. It's still very clear in my head. So she kind of slumped forward. She tried to catch herself, and the next thing I know, she's lying on the floor. When my dad returned sometime later with our neighbors, they walked into what obviously looked like some sort of massacre had occurred. My mom was laying on the floor. I was attending to her. I had my washcloth, which was blood all over it, on her head, and of course I was still bleeding, so there was a lot of blood. And my dad and the neighbors looked down, he's like, "Oh my God, what happened?" And I said, "Mom will be okay. She's okay." So obviously, and I even had her feet propped up, which was interesting, so I was caring for her. So when I ended up in the ER a little bit later, I was the star. As a 3-year-old, a late 3-year-old, but I was still as a 3-year-old, I was going to be the future doctor. And I may add a little more, the ER doctor that day that sewed me up was a DO. Growing up in my household was very challenging. To say we were a dysfunctional family is probably a bit of an understatement. Both my parents quit school by 8th grade, and they later went on to trade schools. We didn't have much as I was growing up. I was raised as an only child. I was shy, and I loved animals. My mom was a hairdresser, and she was a good one at that. My father was an electrician, and he worked a lot of odd jobs. And from the outside looking in, we were essentially the typical lower-class family, just trying to make ends meet. However, most didn't know what occurred inside our home. My father had many demons. He was an alcoholic, and he wasn't the nicest individual when he was drinking. He was mentally, emotionally, and physically abusive. And his demons generally only came out, which thankfully was when he was intoxicated. But it seemed as if he was always searching for a reason to drink. Anything that went wrong at all, it didn't take much. He would start drinking, and then the process would start. I realized at an early age that you should never poke the bear. I learned how to walk around on eggshells so as not to anger him or set him off. I learned to essentially rarely make eye contact with him or speak unless spoken to, out of fear that my expression may be misinterpreted as being disrespectful. I learned to stay out of the way and not bring attention to myself, and essentially just fly under the radar. I was pretty shy too. My mom and I never really spoke about my dad, and truth, we weren't really allowed to. If we were ever overheard doing that, it would anger him, and of course the process would start. Therefore, we never really talked about it, nor did we tell anyone else either. I never told my friends. For all I knew, everyone else's dads did that too, but our household had many secrets. So growing up was challenging. I tried to keep my head down, stay out of my dad's way, and I found comfort in my pets. I will share more than one thing with you. We never really had much. My father spent most of the paycheck on alcohol, but my mom, she was so kind and caring. She was someone who always helped others. There was many a time that I would come home and there would be strange people at our dining room table, and essentially she would invite them over, people that were even less fortunate than we were. She was truly the kindest soul and the heart behind what I still do today. She taught me that no matter who you are or what you do or your financial or social status, that there's always something that you can do to help others. People that never experienced abuse from a loved one probably can't imagine why someone would decide to stay in an environment like that, to expose themselves or their children to the abuse and repeatedly. But the ugly truth is most people are scared. They've been threatened. My dad told my mom that if she ever left him, he would hunt us down and he would kill us both. Thus, she stayed with him, so essentially that I could live. And many abusers make these threats to their family members and hold true to them. When I was 20, after a really tough time right before Christmas, another big fight at our house occurred, and my mom and I ended up at the magistrate's office, got another domestic violence petition against my dad, and he was made to leave the house, and he wasn't supposed to contact either of us. So for the next 20 days through Christmas, New Year's, my mom and I actually spent the most quality time that probably we were able to experience at that point. We started planning a real life together, things we were going to go see, things we were going to do, me going into medical school. It was pretty much the best 20 days of my life up until that point. Tragically, once my dad realized at this time my mom and I weren't going to give in to his previous promises that were all broken of stopping drinking, of getting help, he showed up one evening while I was at work, and he killed her, and then he killed himself. Up until that point, I'd always been home, and I'd always been able to stop it. But that night I was at work, and he knew it. So obviously my life, my world was shattered and ever changed. I was devastated, scared, angry, overwhelmed, and essentially every emotion that you can think of, and probably some that don't really have a name. I was shocked, and I was alone. I took a few weeks off from work and tried to deal with my new life. I discovered what anxiety is and panic attacks. I learned firsthand what bereavement is. I didn't have any other family members that I knew of at the time that I could ask for help. I didn't sleep much. I was scared to, and I'm not really entirely sure why. But I couldn't get away from my fear, my grief, the loneliness. I couldn't get away from the anxiety. So the bills started rolling in, and the funerals, power, heating bill, unexpected mortgages, you name it, and I became scared. I'd never had to pay for any of that before, and I definitely didn't have the means to do it now. So I went back to work. I had to. I had to take the semester off from college because, again, I had to work to pay the bills, and essentially, I couldn't focus anyway. Work tended to take my mind off of things to an extent, but then the moment I got off work, I was hit with them again. The loneliness seeped back in. I knew I was on a dead-end path, and I knew my mom would be devastated. I knew I had to do something. Well, one day when I was driving home from work, I was hit with those thoughts again, the fear, the loneliness, and I just didn't want to be alone. I was scared. I couldn't bear the thought of going back to a quiet, lonely house. So I turned around and I drove to the local ambulance base, and I started volunteering. I had started an EMT class before everything happened, just didn't have time to volunteer when it happened. I didn't tell anyone that night why I was there, and quite frankly, they didn't care. They were welcoming, and I wasn't alone. And on the first call that night, I knew that I was doing what I needed to be doing. I was surrounded by people who welcomed me and supported me, and it was a camaraderie that I had never really experienced before, and essentially an instant extended family, if you will. Over the course of the next few months, I was either working, taking care of my pets, or I was volunteering. I discovered when I was busy, I didn't think about things as much, and I learned that when my mind was idle, that I had to deal with the pain and the hurt, and I had to stay busy. So I unexpectedly discovered that while helping others, I felt better, and that either indirectly or directly, I was helping myself. My anxiety wasn't as profound, the panic attacks were less frequent. It made me feel better when I made a difference in someone else's life, however small or minute that it may seem, like covering them up a little bit more when it was cold, or bringing them a drink, or just smiling at them. I remember several times I babysitted pets of people that had been involved in a wreck until they were able to come pick them up. But all in that process, whether as small or something as minute as that may seem to you, it brought others joy. It gave them comfort. And it thus brought me joy to help others. Eleanor Roosevelt once said that by helping others, we're actually really helping ourselves. And even though I didn't know that quote at the time, that's what was happening to me. Time passed, and I slowly began to heal. The ambulance service started paying me for some shifts and transports, which helped me with the bills, but I still volunteered too. I took on another part-time job as 911 as an emergency dispatcher, and I started volunteering with the fire department. And then I also became a county medical examiner, actually with Dr. Foster. I did all I could to survive, but also to make a difference. And staying busy helped. I started taking classes again when I could afford to, knowing that I was still going to be a doctor someday. And overall, I found my passion for helping others and community service, all while helping myself. So I share my personal story with you not for sympathy. This happened a long time ago, and I went on with my life, but in hopes that it will inspire others, that despite what cards you're dealt with, what family situation you have at home, a lack of support, a lack of money, a lack of time, or any other obstacles that you can possibly think of, if you want something bad enough, you can achieve it, and I am a prime example of that. I also share this story with you to give glory to my mother, who always believed in me, who taught me the importance of kindness and that giving, service-minded spirit. And, of course, for his sacrifices, and ultimately to God, because I'm living proof that he doesn't give us what we can't handle, and through him all things are possible. So a little update, I mentioned we lived in a lot of secrets. I just found out right before the holidays that I actually have a full biological brother. And thanks to COVID, we haven't met yet. He's older, but we are planning a reunion soon, and I'm beyond blessed. So moving forward a little bit, growing up in the shadows of the Western School of Osteopathic Medicine, I always knew I'd come to school here. It did take me a little longer to get here because of the need to work along the way, but I made it. And in July of 2003, I finally started. And the rest is, well, history, or maybe, kind of, although maybe not necessarily the typical course, because who would have ever predicted a pandemic? But I think I might be putting the cart before the horse here, so let's back up a hair. Why did I choose osteopathic medicine? I had osteopathic physicians growing up, the first one being in the ER with my head laceration. And then others along the way. They were kind, knowledgeable, they were skilled, and they really tried to talk and get me out of my shell. And to me, they seemed like they were natural healers. They were kind, compassionate, and for me, they were exceptional role models. For the longest time, I didn't know that there was two types of doctors. I only knew that there was an osteopathic doctor. In my late teens, I met the first MD, which intrigued me, and I started to learn the difference. I didn't understand why everyone didn't take this whole body approach to medicine of body, mind, and spirit. And to me, an MD was the other type of medicine that osteopathic physicians are sometimes referred to now. Osteopathic medicine was the normal to me. So when I get asked why I choose osteopathic medicine, the truth is it's the only medicine that I ever really knew, and the only one that I really felt like made the difference based upon my personal experience. So osteopathic medicine was good for me, but why should others choose it? So Aristotle once said that the body should be treated as more than just the sum of its parts, but isn't that osteopathic philosophy? The holistic approach of treating the person is more than just the sum, but the focus on the whole individual, body, mind, and spirit. Osteopathic training is essentially the same as allopathic medical school, with the exception that you have all of this training in musculoskeletal medicine. And it turns out that structure and function, they're interrelated. Imagine that. So it's an additional tool in your toolbox that you can diagnose and treat your patients, and any additional tool can be so darn valuable. An osteopathic trained individual can still specialize and get into any competitive residencies. There are no limitations, and you have that extra tool. So to me, it's a no-brainer. Why did I choose WVSOM? Well, I mean, honestly, one would make an argument that it's because I could throw a stone and hit here and it's closest. And it's a good argument, but really it was because my experience here with my encounters from DOs, from my first ER visit to preventative visits to broken bones along the way. As Dr. Foster mentioned, my family moved to a farm that kind of was close to Dr. Foster's, and he unknowingly became a mentor to me. I never really disclosed that to him until recently. But he was always so kind and warm and knowledgeable, intuitive, and he, to me, was the perfect osteopathic role model. And the staff at WVSOM, I taught here ACLS and BLS, and they were just so amazing. The environment was kind and supportive, and to me, it felt like home. When I stepped foot in these doors, it felt like this is where I was meant to be, and probably divine intervention again. So why did I choose family medicine? Well, I chose it because of the endless possibilities. I had toyed around with the idea of emergency medicine, internal medicine, but I really like the continuity of taking care of people, all people, infants to geriatrics, the birth to grave, as we commonly say when we're describing the scope of family medicine. But plus the whole preventative health, the emphasis seems to be the only way to really make the biggest impact on our population. And of course the families. Being a part of families, taking care of all of them, and learning their interesting stories. It's truly an honor, in my mind, to be a part of that, and to be well trained so that you truly can take care of all of them, regardless of their age. So osteopathic medicine was a type of medicine that I wanted to learn, and family medicine made the most sense for what I loved to do and what I also thought would make the biggest impact. So speaking of public health, As my bio said, I've done a little bit of everything since residency. What I didn't really anticipate was my love for public health, but perhaps only because I never really considered the things I automatically did, like the EMS, fire, helping with the floods, the derecho, the storms, the mass casualty events. I never really considered that as public health, if that makes sense. To me, helping in those cases was the right thing to do. It's what all people should be doing. So I never really realized it or considered it a part of public health. I really just thought it was public service. So several years ago, when I was looking at the single accreditation system for family medicine residency, and I was reading about public health, the actual requirements, I was very intrigued. I kept thinking, wow, this is something I kind of already do. So I was looking into it, and oddly enough, a few weeks later, I ran into the state health commissioner at a non-health related event. I didn't know who he was. He didn't know who I was. We started talking. We found out what each other did, and he encouraged me to apply. And shortly thereafter, I became the health officer for Greenbrier County. The whole thing was kind of serendipitous, and again, definitely divine intervention. So fast forward a few more years, specifically to December 2019, the news was looking really scary. What on earth is happening in China? A week or so before New Year's, my son was joking around to me, and he said, "Mom, I wonder what's going to happen this year, 2020, this coming year." And I thought, what do you mean? He's like, "Mom, come on. 2016, the flood, flood of 1,000 years. 2012, the derecho. Do I need to say more?" And I thought, well, we are due for a pandemic. Maybe whatever's going on in China just might be it. Sometimes eating your words isn't that fun or tasty. And those were my famous last words. So I now wish that I would have said win the lottery. And in 2024, if he asks me that same question, I'm going to really rethink my words. But let's talk about the pandemic a little bit. December, the whole world started watching China, and you couldn't look anywhere without it popping up on the news, the daily World Health announcements. Things were starting to get scary. And then January 21st, we got our first confirmed case in U.S. soil. And wow, things started getting real pretty fast. I couldn't read enough. I scanned the news from other countries. I read up on previous coronavirus infections and what some of the ones we continue to screen for. We, as in all of us at the health department, we watched, we started planning, we started meeting. The state DHHR started conducting conference calls. We were asked to hold public meetings, and we did on the most up-to-date information that we had, but obviously it was continuously changing. CDC became our favorite website, and we became experts on maneuvering that site, and you all know that can be cumbersome. West Virginia was the last state to get a confirmed case. We anxiously waited, knowing it would happen any day. We kept watching and planning. And then finally the first case at the state level came, and then of course at our county, Greenbrier County. Back then it wasn't uncommon for it to take 2 to 3 weeks before we got confirmation that test was positive. And by that time they were either well or they were really sick. Most of the time they were already out of quarantine. Initially we had to send our test to CDC to test for the COVID virus. And so then eventually West Virginia was able to run its own, but the supplies were still limited. We used viral media, and guess what? That was a shortage like everything else. And so we had to screen and be very vigilant about who we tested and who we decided to test so that we wouldn't run out of supplies. In a perfect world, we would have tested everyone. But in a situation like this, we couldn't. What seemed like an eternity when we started looking at other things, but in the time frame, it really wasn't that long of a time before private labs were able to also do testing. They were initially limited by the viral media too, but then they overcome that, started using normal saline, and life is good. Only then they overcome their capacity, and once again we were slowed down again. Simultaneously, while all this stuff was going on, we started planning and preparing for the worst case scenario, a true disaster situation which was occurring in other countries. Personal protective equipment. Why on earth would there be a shortage? But there was. That was a common question though. But simply because the whole world was dealing with this, and the countries that made the most of it, well, that's where it started. And they were stockpiling. They too were dealing with their own outbreaks and their own surge capacity. And the same thing with the ventilators, the viral media, certain medications. We were in a really different situation than what we're used to. So early in the planning period, maybe late February, somewhere through there, I recall a sobering day. As the health officer, I called all of the hospital, the clinics, EMS, and I said, how much N95s do you have? How much PPE do you have? Wow. Per my calculations, we had about 8 days. Y'all heard me, right? 8 days if we reached surge capacity. And I essentially panicked. I thought, my fellow healthcare providers, along with myself, we're going to be on the front lines, taking care of these people, putting our lives at risk because we don't have enough PPE. Now, granted, this is going on everywhere too, but this is my own story here. So it was scary. The news was highlighting healthcare workers that had contracted COVID and had died. Everyone was kind of in the same position. Every state, every country. People were legitimately scared. News of the national stockpile was comforting, but only for a short time period. It was on every political agenda, every speech. Yet the overwhelming truth was there wasn't much of it. And rumors were it was already limited before COVID had even occurred. The states that got hit the worst, obviously, had already been allocated a lot of it. The states like West Virginia, who were the last to hold out before a confirmed case, we didn't get much. And then before we knew it, it was all gone. So simultaneously during all of this, I went to work. We all did, searching for places internationally to purchase PPE, and lo and behold, they were bootlegging it. They were doing all these money-making schemes. So we started looking at other things that we could do, and one night late, I came across a version of a 3D printed N95 mask, and I kept thinking, would this work? So a couple of days later, I was speaking with another local health officer from a surrounding county, and she had mentioned it too, that she had been looking into it. So it dawned on me. Let's try it. And I remember that the schools were closed. We had a lot of teachers here locally, and we had 3D printers. So lo and behold, we got the 3D printer, I want to call it a recipe, but it's not a recipe, in a capable teacher's hands, and within 12 hours, I had the first prototype in my hand. I wore it around all weekend. It was black, and I called it Darth Vader affectionately. My animals and my husband and my son thought I had lost my mind. But that could be the solution. So I went and I did a fit test on it, and lo and behold, it passed. So I called Dr. Mace here at the school, and her and Dr. Nemitz helped secure funding. The Board of Education was more than supportive and allowed us access to their teachers and their 3D printers. And the next thing we know, we're in business. We were making 3D masks. The Guard actually got a hold of one, did a filtration testing on it. We made some modifications. We kind of moved to another prototype, but we were doing large-scale masks. Now, we didn't market them. We didn't sell them. We gave them away. We did fit testing on them. But this was as if you run out of N95s. This is obviously a good solution, and it will still offer you protection. We had many students and volunteers that also helped with the assembly of those masks and getting them out there. And lo and behold, the state and the National Guard got a hold of this a few weeks later again, revisited it, and the next thing you know, they were doing it throughout the state, kind of following what we had already done. So this was just one small example of a huge win. A huge example of what we can do when there's ideas, a spark, a desire, and sometimes sheer desperation to get things done. And another example of what we can do when we engage our community partners. So also during all of this, we started an instant command at the hospital. We met daily, sometimes twice a day. We planned and planned. We got every major player involved, from the nursing to the lab to the hospitalists, the ER providers, housekeeping, HVAC, all of them, because every one of them played an important role. We planned. We modified our plans based upon new information, and everything was so dynamic, and you just had to keep running with the punches. We had meetings locally and statewide. We started a local task force and then a state task force. And every ounce of information that we could get, I would share with our local providers. I started having daily calls with them and EMS that they could call in voluntarily, and all so that we could plan for the worst case scenario and to make sure that everyone was well prepared, well trained, with the best knowledge that we had, and had the right supplies, the right knowledge, and of course the PPE. We discussed outbreaks, cases, and the capability of all providers, all clinics, what they could do to keep the burden off of the ER. And again, in planning for that surge capacity that we talked about and heard about so much. When it comes to a pandemic, all organizations have to set their personal interests and business goals aside temporarily and work together. And this is what everyone did. This community just rises when it comes to things like this. And we assessed who could test, who could see patients, if it's inside, outside, what we could do. What providers in the area, whether they're retired or working somewhere else, could even step up and get emergency credentialed to help in the hospital in the event we reach surge capacity. And then also looking at other areas that we could open up, again, if we had surge capacity, if we had the staff. I was expected to be the expert locally, obviously, but even on a novel virus, I was expected to know it all. On a virus that hadn't been around a lot, and we didn't know a lot, and we were dependent upon countries that weren't always or have not always been transparent. So we watched CDC, and we kept on participating in these Zoom meetings, and we planned and we planned. I couldn't read enough. I didn't know all the answers, and I had questions myself. But we just kept on trucking away and trying to figure this all out. We met, we planned some more, and when the information changed, we met, we planned some more, and we adapted. And from the local level, again, looking at our capacity and the predicted surge capacity to available beds, ICU beds, ventilators, space to staff, and other areas, like I said, to see if we had to open it up in the event that we did reach surge capacity. We did everything we could to get the correct information out to our people and our communities, clear and concise and consistent. From the social media to the news to public meetings to forums to task force meetings, and notes were readily available. We collaborated with our community partners, again, trying to make sure we're all speaking the same language. Testing became more readily available, and thus in that process, more cases, and thus contact tracings. Contact tracings became such a huge part of our days, our weekends, our nights. Testing, contact tracings, more testing, more contact tracings, more education to the public, shutdowns, shelter in place, mandatory mask wearing, get a correct and consistent word out there to our people. All of our evenings, weekends, holidays, they were all consumed by this. And I'm just going to tell you that dealing with the public, well, sometimes people aren't always pleasant. That's a news eye-opener for any of you that haven't experienced that. And then all of a sudden the vaccine talk started on the horizon. And we started planning again, a whole bunch of what ifs. Ultra cool vaccines, what? What does that mean? -70, holy cow. mRNA, oh my goodness. So then, thus, more reading, more education, and more trying to get this out to our providers and our people. We started talking about large vaccination events and how each county could handle it, how to store it, how to handle it, how to get the people convinced to doing it. Way before we knew anything about these vaccines and way before we knew which ones were coming to us first. I won't lie, it was a lot. But that's one of the reasons why the vaccines, once they were available in West Virginia, why we were so successful. Because we started planning very early and we what-ifed things to death. We truly, what if this, what if that, to death. Ultra cool, the regional hubs, working with the Guard, the logistics of all of it, locally, regionally, and on a state level. Our state had a governor who listened and had great leadership from the state level that trickled down into all the counties, or most of the counties. And everyone had a passion to get this done and get shots in arms because we knew that it would save lives. I remember the Pfizer when it arrived. That's the first one that we got, first one approved. And 2 days after it was approved, I held the vial in my hand and I had a tear in my eye. I was kind of emotional. And I was never so grateful to get a shot in my arm. I was the first one in Greenberg County to get it, to set an example. So very quickly, we started getting more. The state gave us a directive on who to vaccinate based upon exposures, based upon vulnerabilities, our highest risk. We started on the frontline medical personnel and the critical infrastructure first. Then we started on the 80-year-olds and above, the nursing homes, because we realized that when an outbreak occurred at a nursing home, it was really, really bad. The outcome, the significant number of lives lost, it was just completely devastating. So we continued to have weekly vaccine clinics working off our list on our direction. Our supply was limited. Sometimes the entire state only got 20,000 vaccines around. So we were maneuvered through a bunch of different systems as well. We had a ton of new computer systems that we had to work through, checkouts, VAMs, Everbridge. There's some more too. We at Greenbrier County was one of the counties designated as a regional vaccine hub. We literally put over 1,000 shots in arms weekly and are still doing so. We organized huge weekly events that initially required only about 50 volunteers, but since then they've grown. And we worked with our community partners to do this too. Volunteers lined up and were so eager to get their shots in to help. We started having these at the state fair and made the New York Times for the location and the strategy. We made world news for some of the things that we were doing. We strategized after each event, and we fine-tuned the problems. And interestingly enough, Mother Nature was our biggest obstacle with the snow and the storms, but people still showed up. The days were long and still are. The scheduling of events exhausting. It took 6 days to schedule a huge vaccine clinic, and plus we're also doing all of our other responsibilities. And I may add on our health department, we have an old phone system that's still in the process of getting updated. And we had 2 phone lines. So that was a lot of fun too. So the vaccine clinics, they're exhilarating, but they're draining. But everyone is just so darn excited to get these shots in arms because we know we're saving lives. So we empowered our community. We became a well-oiled vaccination machine. We watched our infection rate drop, all because of these efforts. And the whole process was and still is amazing. Our community is incredible. And as I said earlier, people came out of the woodwork to volunteer and to help. And it wouldn't be possible to do it on the scale of which we've done and to get the number of people vaccinated with all of our community partners and our volunteers. The entire state of West Virginia rose to this occasion. For a long time, we led the U.S. in vaccines given and utilization. I haven't looked for a few weeks. A few weeks ago, we, as in West Virginia, were third in the entire world for getting this done. And why, may you ask? And that's just because West Virginia has strong leadership that preemptively did whatever they could to plan and to get this out there, but also because of the sheer determination and grit of our people, our West Virginians. So I'm going to stop and say that obviously I didn't do all this by myself. I have incredible staff and coworkers at the health department that always go above and beyond. They have been there every step of the way beside of me and have stepped in to do so many things that are way beyond their job description. With planning to the testing, to answering the phones, to scheduling and to vaccinating, all while handling all of our other responsibilities. And I'm so proud to work with them and have them on my team because truly I think that they are some of the best in the state. And heck, with our vaccination clinic success, one could make that big jump and say in the world. So we continue in this battle and the rest is yet to be determined. It's not over yet. There's a lot of what ifs. But let's just take a few minutes and talk about public health in case any of you all are interested in that. So some of you may think, well, how do I get into this as far as practicing rural public medicine? And so essentially, qualifications to do public health in a rural area are a health officer, or just to do rural public health is an MD or DO. And you can be trained in internal medicine, family medicine, peds, infectious disease, even public health. As far as being a health officer, obviously there has to be a need and a position open. But a graduate physician can do this. You don't have to work at a health department to get involved in rural public health. And all practitioners, let's face it, if you're doing what we should be doing, are educating our people from one patient to the next, to the families, to our communities, about preventative injuries, about exercise, the use of car seats, helmets, seatbelts, vaccines, by addressing the needs of individual patients and, of course, the needs of the community that you serve, like infectious disease, clean water, or other environmental exposures. So I personally think the best pathway to get involved in public health is through family medicine. Now, obviously, you can pursue a master's degree in public health, but I believe that family medicine is the best path. And our osteopathic training puts us at an advantage to practice in medically underserved areas due to that exposure that you get in medical school, the mission of WVSOM, and by rotating with experienced providers in rural health, which is a requirement. So essentially, to reiterate all of that, all primary care and pediatric disciplines do this in their practice anyway, as far as public health. The extent of which they focus or develop their practice is really dependent upon them. And as far as educational background or credentials needed, again, an MD or DO behind your name, but preferably a DO, and a desire to make a difference. Your osteopathic training has prepared you well, even if you don't realize it. You've already had on-the-job training. And again, you don't have to work in a health department. Public health starts with the individual patient, and then the families, and then the community, and you address the specific needs of your community. And they can be unique or they can be common. Unique like opiate overdoses, clean water. And those are just some examples. But essentially, once you start working in a rural area, you dive in. Some problems are apparent, some may not be. But once you address those needs of your patients and you identify them, then essentially get involved, do the research behind it, figure out what resources are available, find the resources, figure it out, get your hands dirty, so to speak. The pandemic has raised a lot of attention on health disparities in rural medicine. We know that rural Americans don't have the healthcare access that we do in urban areas. We know that children that may have developmental, mental, or behavioral disorders don't do as well in rural areas than they do in urban areas. And obviously that's likely due to resources. We know that Americans in rural areas are more likely to die from heart disease, from strokes, from MVAs, from unintentional accidents and injuries. And really, the injuries and opiate overdoses are about 50% higher in rural areas than in urban. So there's so many challenges, and the pandemic kind of exposed that again and the importance of public health. So essentially, I challenge every one of you to get involved and make an impact. By not just your patients, you can get involved in your community, in the schools. You can educate your public about bicycle helmets, about ATVs, about boating, about immunizations. Again, not just to your patient panel, but to your community. The flood of 1,000 years in 2016 proved that from tetanus shots to delivering medicine to doing welfare checks to working with the Guard on temporary housing or shelters and to helping with the displaced animals and right down to getting on some gloves and a shovel and cleaning up. There are so many things that can be done. You can assure the quality and accessibility of services to your surrounding area. You can develop a satellite clinic that you travel to once a week or twice a week, and you can assess and address the needs of rural health and the people in those areas. There's so many challenges and so much need. You can do a little or a lot, and all while addressing the needs from chronic disease to the health disparities and the unique needs within the population that you serve. And the interesting thing here is when you work in a rural area, you truly are a pillar of that community. You have so many responsibilities. You wear many different hats, but it is so tremendously rewarding and challenging, but rewarding. So West Virginia WVSOM has exposed, the graduates have made such a tremendous impact along the way, not just during this pandemic, but in our local communities, our counties, and even to a much larger level, to the state and national level. From our vaccine events, from our mask making, and essentially all of our frontline providers taking care of these incredibly sick, critical patients. I myself may live and work in a rural area, yet I was on a state task force call and state leadership call that I'm still a part of. And there are countless amazing WVSOM graduates that have done so in the state, like Kanawha County's Dr. Sherry Young and Fayette County Dr. Anita Stewart, to name a few. The pandemic showed us what we already knew, that we're all in this together, that we each can make a difference. And when it comes to community health, it takes a community working together to protect a community. And you can take that to the largest scale possible. A recent infectious disease expert actually stated that it's going to take about 10 years to get on the other side of COVID-19, and the reason where it crosses species. So essentially, in order to end the COVID pandemic, that we have to treat our entire world ecosystem. Now that's something to think about, but that's for another conversation. So I'll leave that for you all to ponder. One way or the other, despite our best wishes, COVID-19 pandemic is not going away anytime soon. We in the state of West Virginia have done amazing things, and we've put us in the spotlight of the entire world, and we have a lot of momentum. So once we're able to shift gears a little bit from the fight against COVID, I challenge all of you to utilize this energy and momentum that we've built up and start addressing our other needs. Let's take West Virginia from the bottom, from unhealthy, to the top as healthy. We as West Virginians have proven that, and we can do it. I'm so blessed to do what I do. I work with incredible people who are passionate about our mission, not only at the health department, but our hospital, our community, the school, and of course our state. I have a supportive husband, a son, a granddaughter on the way, a stepson with a grandson already here, and as I said earlier, I have a brother that I can't wait to get to know more. My life didn't start off the way that most would have planned, but I was blessed to have a loving mom who believed in me and showed me the importance of helping others. She lit that fire within me, and God blessed me far more than I deserve. And I've had inspiring, great osteopathic physicians along the way, such as Dr. Foster, who has mentored me. So divine intervention directed me the rest of the way where I'm here today. And how else could you explain that? I believe I'm meant to be doing what I'm doing, and it's such an honor to do it. So in closing, I hope you choose osteopathic medicine if you're on the fence and haven't decided yet. And I highly recommend WVSOM, who continuously creates these phenomenal physicians that address our underserved areas. If you're already in medical school, I hope you choose a rural, medically underserved area to practice in, or at least have a clinic, a satellite clinic that you can help treat these unhealthy and vulnerable people. And I hope you I hope you choose to participate to a higher level than just treating one patient at a time, but to incorporate public health into your practice above just the mandatory reporting. And remember, even if you do not go to medical school, for all those other people out there, there's always something that you can do to help. This pandemic is just one good example of why public health and rural medicine are so darn important. But if you need more, just look around our beautiful state, and you'll find thousands of other great reasons. Together we can end this pandemic and take our communities to a higher level of health. So thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen to my personal story and my adventure into medicine and fighting this pandemic. Please consider getting the COVID vaccine if you have not gotten it. Please, please, please continue to be vigilant. Wear your mask, social distance, and obviously wash your hands until we can get on the other side of this. Let's continue to protect each other, ourselves, and our vulnerable populations. Together we can do this. So please be safe. Please take care of yourselves. And thank you again for tuning in to me today.
Stay right there, Dr. Morrison. Wow, what a courageous story. I'm going to get back in the scene just a minute. You stay right there.
Okay.
Just wanted to say that Dr. Morrison is still our Director of Medical Education over there. She's been in charge of the residency programs at the hospital. I won't name all the things, but also, and you can see why now, just recently honored with the Provider of the Year from the West Virginia Rural Health Association. Only one of many awards. And I'll tell you that every event that I've seen that required help from others in the community, derecho, the flood, whatever, anytime I was out there or looked around or drove by, there was Bridget with students and residents, etc. She can't help but do that, and she's done that whole bit through part-time single mom, totally responsible for all of where things will. But she's right, it's divine orchestration. I often say D-O, big D, little O, stands for divine orchestration. So we can now take some questions. We have a little time left. Just unmute your mic and go right ahead, and we'll let Bridget stay here and answer some for a while. I have to tell you that her phone was right by me and ringing most of this whole time, and I'm sure she was hearing it, but that's part of the life of a doctor in public health. And I would also add that the reason we're number one in part for this vaccination deliveries, getting it out there to the people, and all the other successes is, as Bridget says, leadership and all, but it takes a village. We are so blessed to be in a rural area that does take care of its own and does what they can when they can, and they go looking to see where they can fit in, whatever their credentials or their skills are. Any questions for Dr. Morrison? I have one. I wanted to pass on that she's also a horse person still. I don't know when you find the time to do that, but that's still a big part of your life. Are there other things that you get to do when you can find 20 minutes?
I love to spend time with my family. I love to hike. I love to garden. But I have a lot of animals, and they still are my comfort zone when I've dealt with those not so pleasant people that sometimes we have to deal with in public health.
And she just told me she has a new horse, which she's going to show next weekend.
Hopefully this coming weekend.
So this is not a small avocation. This is part of her, her passion as well, and family. And I said I babysat Logan, her son, but I think I only took him when you were off to work before daylight, and then got him to school and back again. So she's been doing this all of her life independently and managing to get it all done. So I don't know if she ever had a babysitter. Probably not, but certainly I was there. Are there questions? Okay. Looks like we've got it. I'm glad you all were here today. I hope you enjoyed the meal. I'll say that it was a plant-based meal and anti-inflammatory. So she talked about prevention and us having all the diseases and number one in a lot of things. It's nice to be number one in some other things, but this was cooked by our chefs. It was plant-based. It's a chance for you all to try something a little different, but things that will not cause you cancer, that are not known to be carcinogenic. But there is we put a little sour cream in there and a squeeze packet. So if you want to make an inflammatory diet, go right ahead. Add the dairy to it and enjoy. Thanks for being here, and thank you, Dr. Morrison, for just an amazing life story. And this is the journeys that we all find ourselves in, and every one of us has a story to tell. So thank you for sharing yours.
Thank you for listening.